All right, hello students. We are going to continue with our discussion of Mao Zedong. This movie is going to be called Part 2, Mao Zedong Part 2. We will continue from where we left off the last time. If I remember correctly, the last place we left off was something called the Great Leap Forward. All right, now what the heck was that? If you recall, Mao is the official leader, recognized leader of China, what is now called the People's Republic of China, after the victory, if you will, in Civil War. That, of course, followed the victory over the Japanese during World War II, where the nationalists and the communists sort of worked together to defeat the Chinese. Civil War broke out afterwards. The nationalists escaped to what we call today Taiwan. So the Great Leap Forward is this effort, and we see some, if you recall the discussion about Lenin and Stalin, you're going to see some parallels here, even though these are not perfectly parallel stories. One of the things that the Soviet Union do, and in particular Stalin, he was very much interested in how the Soviet Union / Russia could catch up to the rest of the world in its industry production. Remember, the Industrial Revolution came late to Russia. It came even later to China. And so this Great Leap Forward is this attempt to increase food and industry, in other words, agricultural and industry production in the 1950s. Now, if you may also recall, when we discussed Stalin had these things called 5-year plans. And this is exactly what this is sort of modeled on. I make this comment that Mao and Stalin were not really fans of each other. But I think that this is instructive to sort of compare it to the 5-year plans of Stalin. If you recall, those things were these grandiose plans to move agricultural production from where it was to where it could be, from move industrial production and industrial projects, really get them fast-tracked. Stalin would always mention that every 5-year plan was achieved in less time, demonstrating how impressive they were. One of the things about the Great Leap Forward, however, was that there were no specific 5-year plans in China. However, what I wanted to point out was the Great Leap Forward did something. They basically said, we're going to rely on manpower more than machine power. And a lot of this still is an issue of lack of industrialization in China at that particular time. Now, this belief, this is again Marxist doctrine, if you will, about how we believe in the individual worker, and the individual worker will work for the greater good, and we will achieve these things. But with the lack of machine power, production goals were seldomly met. And now we start to see even more so the brutality we start to see under the regime of Mao Zedong. When production goals were not met, there were retaliations against citizens. And these retaliations could be very harsh and brutal. And we start to see the numbers start to add up of Mao killing his own people. Okay? It gets worse. And so let's sort of finish this sort of discussion off here. One of the things that happened during this time period was there's an element where Mao is trying to reach out to what I call the elite and intellectual class of China for assistance, for getting the real Marxist revolution going. Remember one of the problems that Marxists all had is that Marx assumed that revolutions would just automatically happen and that workers would just automatically revolt. Both Lenin and Mao realized that that wasn't necessarily the case, that workers would not just revolt. They needed leadership. They needed people to get them activated. They needed people to get them roused up, if you will. And so Lenin for sure, and here is Mao also trying to get what are, for lack of a better way of putting it, more well-educated, more intelligent people to get involved. However, in China, Mao felt like the elite intellectual class betrayed him. He felt like they did not go along with the Marxist viewpoint that he was trying to adhere to. And so here we go into what is probably the most significant thing we should sort of talk about when we talk about Mao. I'm going to call this the TRC. This is known as the Cultural Revolution. And this is where we see the real brutality emerge. This is where we really start to see how bad this is going to get. Okay? The Cultural Revolution was for a 10-year period, and this was also a purge campaign. This is very similar to Stalin's Great Purges in many ways. Stalin used the KGB, the secret police service that he was sort of the mastermind behind, even before the revolution, the Russian Revolution of 1917. He used the KGB as his mechanism, as his force to take out those that he considered to be his enemies. So in China, we see the same thing. Mao is going to purge from society anyone who opposes this process. Sorry about that. This is really just a way to eliminate enemies. Now, one of the things that needs to be documented here, needs to be said, is that China has its own version of a paramilitary group. And this is the significant thing I want you to learn about today. And that is the formation of what was called the Red Guard. The Red Guard was younger people, really mostly college-age students, but they went into the high schools, into what we would call the high schools, to recruit boys and girls to literally carry out the purges. Now, what do you mean by that? Well, they became, for lack of a better way of putting it, a paramilitary group. And these Red Guard soldiers, if you will, they wore green uniforms and green hats. They wore red armbands. As they got a little bit older, they were armed up by the government. That means they were given weapons. And they carried around something called the Little Red Book. Now, this was a book authored by Mao himself. And it was called the Little Red Book because it wasn't very long, and the way they published it is they kept it small enough where it could be kept in a person's pocket so the person could have it all the time. And what they would do is the Red Guard, these young people, would memorize the book. Literally, they would memorize it. It wasn't long enough. It wasn't very long, so it wasn't difficult to memorize it. That's exactly what they did. They memorized the book. And then what would they do? And I want to make this point very clear. This is a paramilitary group, a group that is parallel. It's really militaristic, if you will, and it's not officially the Chinese military, but it runs parallel along with the Chinese military as a military organization in and of itself. They would go around and they would literally get after people, particularly older people. They would go. A lot of these young people were from they were from various parts of China, but they would really go out. In many cases, they would go out into the rural communities, and they would publicly harass people, and they would try to get people to recite parts of the Little Red Book. And if the individual, the adult, remember these are younger people, if the older people could not recite from the Little Red Book, well, they'd get beat up. They would sometimes be thrown in prison. They would get tortured. They would be put to death by the state or by the Red Guard themselves. And this is exactly, this is literally what they did. And so this is a picture giving you an example of what they look like. You can see the militaristic look of them. They're reading from the Little Red Book. They're all dressed alike. Okay? And you can see that this is the way to carry out intimidation factor for the Maoist regime. And you get a real idea that this is not the first time that I don't think this is the very first time you've heard a story like this about something like a paramilitary group. Okay, does this remind you of something? Well, it reminds me of the, I suppose you could say, it reminds me of the KGB in the Soviet Union, but there are other instances from history that you should recall and remember. That are very similar to that as well, and we'll go through that. So Mao dies in 1976, and I'll just sort of make one sort of last note here in the grand scheme of things before I get to the importance, and that was that a very interesting sort of pseudo-alliance tries to began between the Chinese and the United States, and there were backdoor discussions about having an American president come and visit China, and that's exactly what happened. I believe it was 74, 73 or something like that, where President Nixon actually went and visited China, and a U.S. president had never done that before. And so that was a big deal, and that was not just the political aspect. There were cultural exchanges and athletic exchanges and things like that. And I suppose one of the great best examples of the exchange of things like that was that the Chinese Olympic team came to Los Angeles to participate in the Olympics in 1984, when the rest of the communist world, led by the Soviet Union, boycotted the American Olympic Games at that time. But the Chinese did come, so those types of things. Okay, so now let's sort of finish this discussion off. We'll finish with our importance. Point number one. One of the things that we should keep in mind is that when Mao was a young man, he was very well versed and well learned in the art of war. This was not just some intellectual college student who didn't know anything about getting his hands dirty. He certainly knew how to fight. And what I would sort of comment here is because of the lack of large amounts of industrialized weaponry and transportation, the communists always had to fight what is called guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is hit and run tactics, retreat tactics, not direct frontal assault tactics. And so one of the things that Mao was very adept at was teaching people how to do this, and he taught the peasantry class, really the agricultural peasantry class, how to do this. And this strategy was really effective against the Japanese in World War II, and it was effective for the communists when they fought the nationalists in the Civil War. The nationalists was more well supplied, even though I would probably say that the Chinese were not very well supplied at all during World War II. The Chinese nationalists were slightly more well supplied than the communists were. All right, so he deserves acknowledgement for that aspect of his young life. I would say that you would think, many people would probably say they would think, if you think about the Cold War in a cursory way, you would say, well, the Soviet Union and the Chinese must have just gotten along great. And that's not really the case. They did not. There was always a distrustful relationship, and really when you get down to it with Stalin and Mao, what you're really talking about is, yeah, they're Marxists, and yes, they're communists and all that, but really they are both concerned, and what is a major aspect of their leadership style was that Stalin said, hey, the Soviet Union first. Mao said, hey, China first. These are not workers of the world unite type guys. They are not international socialists. These guys are really sort of more, their nation is more in front. So therefore, in many cases, the Chinese and the Soviet Union had different national goals on certain aspects, including the spread of communism, that they didn't always get along. And I commented earlier that Mao was no fan of Stalin, and I would sort of say vice versa. So during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, we historians now acknowledge that there lots of people killed, lots of Chinese people killed. And this is where we really get into this whole idea of the worst of the worst and how some of the greatest killers of history, Mao is right up there. And estimates are a minimum of 30 million people killed. Some estimates are higher. There are Chinese people killed after. Certainly, hey, look, there were people killed before Chinese. I'm not disputing the fact that Chiang Kai-shek was a killer of his own people as well. All right, so, but the fact of the matter is that the numbers under Mao jumped, particularly during the Cultural Revolution and with the rise of the Red Guard. Okay, and look, I would have to say that anybody who studies China certainly is an exhaustive and extensive and exhaustive amount of material to study of the history of China, but Mao is certainly one of the most grand figures of history of China, both ancient and modern, and somebody that cannot be forgotten. Okay, so now let's take a look at this, and I think this is a very fascinating, this is an example of a propaganda poster. This is also sort of a thing with the Red Guard. You can sort of see that the guys are uniformed up. Okay, they have the little red book here. They got their red hats. But again, if you sort of notice here, the way this is sort of set up, how does this look? Well, this looks like the masses. This is my classic horizontal line with the small horizontal line above the big one. The masses all look, the faceless masses all are together. Really not too much individuality in these pictures, is there? And then what rises above? Well, Mao rises above that. And these, maybe these pictures maybe this picture reminds you of another propaganda poster. Does this, remember this one I showed you of Stalin? Sort of the same kind of thing, correct? The masses and all that thing. And let's not kid ourselves that this type of thing can also be seen in pictures like this, where you have the brown shirt. Here's the brown shirts, the same sort of idea of a paramilitary group, just like this one, a paramilitary group with somebody above it, okay, and you get this Hitlerite type thing. So we see these similar types of propaganda posters in these various dictatorship oligarchy situations. And then to leave you, I'll just leave you with this last picture, is that this is Mao as an older gentleman. This is probably during the Cultural Revolution, probably at the very beginning of it. And you can see maybe some young Chinese students there who end up, maybe some of them end up being members of the Red Guard even themselves, okay? All right, so the story of Mao Zedong, one of the very, very interesting, fascinating stories of all time. He's a very significant character of modern world history. All right, I hope you learned something new today. Hope you enjoyed the context and the content of that discussion. All righty, aloha.